Hey, Jason.
Hey, Judson.
So what are we doing tonight?
Well, that is a fantastic question.
John 13?
No. I don't know what's happening with my voice. I was kind of down in the basement a little bit today while I was teaching class and stuff, but here the last hour or so now it feels like it's going away altogether. So if it just disappears on me, you're going to have to jump in.
Okay.
So excuse me if I'm squeaky and coffee a little bit. It feels like a major shift of gears here. Do you agree?
I think so. It's we are bouncing back to Old Testament scriptures, and it's a little different. It's not about necessarily the life of Jesus. It's about prophesying about that life that is to come.
Getting us ready for that life a little bit. And so we are. This is according to plan, all the way from the beginning when we kind of set out to do Isaiah from the beginning. We knew that it was going to be a long study because it's got so many chapters. So we decided to break that up by doing a New Testament study in the middle. But then we didn't want to rush through John, so we decided to break John up into two pieces and do part of John and then go back and finish Isaiah, and that's what we're doing. So Isaiah 1 through 39 is what we covered previously, and we're ready now to jump in and do chapters 40 through 66. But it's been like 4.5, 5 months since we were in Isaiah. So if we just jump in chapter 40, how many of you remember all the stuff from chapters 1 through 39? Yeah, me neither.
Yeah.
I didn't. I had to go back and look at all this stuff. I thought, oh yeah, there were some really good things that we talked about, and some really important historical context and setting. Now there is a shift in the kind of the focus of Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 39 it provides a natural break for us. There's kind of it's a good place to stop one study and start a new one. So it's not like it just picks up with kind of, and then the next thing that happened in chapter 40. So there's a natural break there, and the focus shifts from kind of some things that are going on in the immediate life of Isaiah and some things that he's dealing with to more of a future focus in chapters 40 and following. And we'll get into all that later on as we move into actual studying those chapters. But for now, we're going to go back and actually look at kind of a brief history of chapters 1 through 39. As if you believe that, you guys know us well enough now that we tend to not be very brief, but we're going to do the best we can to try to cover 39 chapters tonight. So listen fast, because we're going to talk fast. So the first part we start off with, it's going to seem like we're not starting fast because we're going to kind of review chapter 1 a little more fully, and then just to kind of set the stage, and then we're going to jump in and just try to cover things pretty quick after that. I put this slide in at the beginning because as I went through all of our old slideshows and kind of reviewed stuff, this slide kept showing up over and over again. It was like we cut and pasted this one in too. It's kind of like when we go back and review John later, we're going to have the 7 I am statements and the 7 signs. Those are going to show up over and over again on all those slideshows. So this one shows up over and over again. It kind of gives us that general overview of the 3 sections of Isaiah 1 through 39 that we looked at. So chapters 1 through 12 takes place during the Syro-Ephraimite War, which Justin is going to explain to us in detail here in just a little bit. And then chapters 13 through 23 is kind of a catch-all section where we're gonna that was like just a couple of lessons in the middle. We covered those 10 or 11 chapters really, really quick comparatively to the other chapters because it was just like, here's another nation that's close to Israel, and here's what we don't like about them kind of thing. And it just is a review of all those nations around Israel that had done them wrong at some point and how they were going to be punished for that. And then Isaiah 24 through 39 takes place during the Assyrian siege of 701. So there's a very concentrated block of time that those chapters cover, and the historical things that are going on during that time set the stage for all the theological things that Isaiah wants to bring out and wants the people to understand, and how they should respond to the fact that they're under attack, and how they should deal with that, and how they should put their trust in God during that time. So those are the three divisions of chapters 1 through 39, and kind of the historical things that are going on during that time. The theme of the book is the nature of God and how he relates to his people. And that might be a theme for the Bible. It might just be, that's a very generalized way of looking at most of the Bible. But Isaiah gets into, who God is and what he expects of his people. And then kind of what happens if they don't give him what he expects, or if they don't do what he expects, how is God going to respond? And that gets back then into his nature, because he doesn't respond outside of his own character or outside of his own nature. So if they're doing what he wants them to do, he responds predictably. And if they're not doing what he wants them to do, he responds predictably, because God is predictable. He is who he is. And when he says something, he means it, and he will do it. So Isaiah lays out who God is and how his people should live in response to who he is. A couple of historical or background things that are helpful to know as you study the book of Isaiah. Isaiah is called an 8th century prophet because he wrote
in the 7th century.
He wrote during the 8th century. 8th century BC, so the 700s BC is the time frame of Isaiah's ministry and his writing. The capital, Jerusalem is the capital of Judah. The kingdom is split by that time. We have the northern kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah, and much of the context in the historical setting takes place in Jerusalem, where Isaiah lives and is prophesying. Judah was a small nation amongst other small nations in that region. There were some big nations to the north, and some big nations to the south, and some big nations to the far east. But they were surrounded by really some small and fairly weak nations directly in context of where Judah is. All tucked in between Assyria and Egypt, who were the dominant world powers at that time. There's a quick map for you to look at that kind of shows where, I can't do this over my shoulder. This is so hard to do backwards. There we go. Hard to do forwards. Jerusalem right there. And then you've got nations like Philistia and Edom and Moab, Ammon, Aram, Damascus, and up here is Assyria, and way down here would be Egypt. So lots of those smaller nations around that are going to figure into that central portion of the text where they're mentioned. Brief history of Israel during the 10th century. That's the golden age of Israel. That's when David was king, Solomon was king, the temple was built, the money was flowing into the kingdom. They were winning their battles. They were a dominant regional power, if not world power at that point. They didn't have to fear anybody coming in and attacking them because they were strong enough to ward off any attacks. During the 9th century, there was civil war. That's when the kingdom divides. After Solomon dies, we have, early in the 9th century there, we have the division of the kingdom between Jeroboam and Rehoboam, and bad stuff starts happening after that. The northern kingdom especially falls off into paganism, and we have the prophets Elijah and Elisha during that time. We also have regional political unrest, the rise of dominant world powers, and the first 4 writing prophets, Micah and Isaiah in Judah, and Amos and Hosea in Israel. Those are things going on during that time. Religion in Jerusalem during that time focused around the temple. Solomon had built the temple. That became the predominant place of worship during that 10th century. Scripture was becoming kind of... They had written scripture before that, but it was really becoming codified. It was really becoming something that they could count on having a copy of in their temples and even in the synagogues and synagogue worship or synagogue became kind of localized places of worship. They ignored the needs of widows and orphans. That's mentioned over and over during Isaiah. They tolerated injustice. We talked a lot about that as we went through this study. They sought international alliances instead of relying on God. That's one of the major things that Isaiah tries to counsel the kings of Judah about, is that they don't rely on outside power when there's a threat. They should rely on God, but they don't listen. When do they ever listen? Early in chapter 1, we find that Isaiah is talking about relationship between God and his people, and he gives some models for that relationship. He talks about the Father and the Son, and how God is the model father, but Israel is the rebellious son. And then he talks about a doctor-patient relationship, where God is the doctor, the physician that has the treatment, has the plan for making the patient well, but the patient doesn't listen. That never happens. I mean, you really, in real life, the patient always does exactly what the doctor says. And you want to chime in? It's too close to home there. So we can relate to that. How many of us, if the doctor looked at, told us we need to do something different, and we go off about our business. And then we looked at the husband-wife relationship. God is the model husband. He is the faithful husband, but Israel was the unfaithful wife. And so those relationships sort of served as an example in chapter 1 for us to think about and really set a context for much of what follows, especially in those first 12 chapters. Isaiah chapter 1 identified some problems that were on display in Israel, and especially why God was unhappy with the people of Jerusalem. He talked about problems with worship. The worship was vain and empty. He talked about problems with their ethics. They permitted injustice and unrighteousness. They allowed that to go on within their community. When people are being oppressed, it's often those who are being oppressed that can't do anything about it. And so other people who are strong enough to fight them, who are strong enough to fight on their behalf, need to stand up and let their voices be heard against that oppression. But nobody was willing to do that. They were allowing that oppression and that injustice to exist within their community, and that's not okay. There's a great lesson there for us. We shouldn't be silent when we see injustice taking place in our society today. And then there was outright rebellion. People were rebelling against God. They were depending on foreign alliances rather than on God, especially as it related to their own safety and welfare. There were 3 solutions presented. They should repent. Kind of obvious for people who know what the Bible says and believe in the Bible. If you're doing the wrong thing, you should stop it and start doing the right thing. That's repentance. They should refine. That is, they should hone their understanding of who God is. They should hone their skills in dealing with one another. And then there's another solution, punishment. If you don't repent, if you don't refine what you're doing, then God will step in and act. And, as parents, if you're a parent, you understand that. You give your kids some options and you talk to them about making good choices. And then at some point you step in and you say, you know what? If you can't make the right choice on your own, I'm going to make the choice for you. There's going to be consequences for you making that choice. So punishment becomes kind of that final consequence. All right, that was chapter 1. How am I doing?
Oh, pretty good.
Okay.
Pretty good. Yeah, I just, this is where we get God's, I do not delight in the blood of bulls, goats, of lambs, or of goats. I guess I said goats already. But it's God. Their vain worship will be kind of talked about multiple times. Of you worship with one hand, but you are committing idolatry with the other.
Yeah. Or oppressing the weak with the other, or serving yourself with the other. Whatever it is, whether it's not outright idolatry, it's something that God doesn't approve of, which affects the way He views their worship, their sacrifices.
And and just as we go through the rest of the chapters of hopefully as we get through the rest of the chapter, the themes of the leaders of Israel are leading them astray, and it's the leaders and the rich and those who are oppressing the poor that need to hear this message. And so the leaders of Israel will be a big symbol that will come up in Isaiah, and a symbol of the city. It shows up in chapter 1, and it will show up multiple times again. There's going to be the New Jerusalem, especially when we get to chapters 40 through 66, about the New Jerusalem, the things that will happen when we have a new city that comes through these trying times. And so those are two pretty big themes throughout the book of Isaiah, of the leaders that are leading the people astray, and the city that has essentially fallen because of the decisions that they are choosing to make.
Yeah, there's so much good application there for us today about it is the leaders that are being held accountable for leading the people astray, but the people themselves are held accountable for following those leaders and going astray. And we have to remember that as we can't just push that blame off on somebody else and say, well, the church leaders did this, or the government did this, or society's going this way, or whatever, and there was nothing we could do about it, so we just went along with it. Well, that's never true. We have the right and the ability to stand up. Even if nobody else around us is standing up and doing the right thing, we're still accountable for what we do. And so that's an important application, I think. Johnny?
That's one of the hopeful things in all of this. God always reminds them there's a remnant.
Yes.
There's a remnant.
And especially as we get into the later chapters, that's what we're setting up for kind of early on. Early on, God often talks about that punishment portion as a kind of an incentive or a hope of staving off their kind of their final slide into rebellion, or their final slide into idolatry, or whatever it is. But eventually that slide takes place, and the punishment comes. The punishment happens. And it's within the context of that punishment then that God often kind of shifts what he's talking about. And he's done talking about punishment because the punishment is here. And now we're going to talk about restoration. What do we do after the punishment takes place? We tried to warn so that the punishment wouldn't happen, but now that it's here, what next? And that's where we're going to find ourselves in chapters 40 through 66 a lot, is talking about that New Jerusalem, about the remnant, about the restoration that will take place. Chapters 2 through 4, there was this contrast between the reality of the way Israel was living and the potential that God saw. Remember those relationships that God talked about, or Isaiah talked about in chapter 1. There is an ideal father-son relationship. God saw that potential within Israel. He wanted that ideal father-son relationship, and he was the ideal father, and he wanted them to be the ideal son. He was the ideal husband. He wanted them to be the ideal wife. He was the ideal physician. He wanted them to be the ideal patient. And so God saw that potential, and he always longed for that, the fulfillment of that potential, but then there's the contrast with the reality of the way they were living. And we see that played out in chapters 2 through 4, where God says, here's what I hope for you, here's what I want from you, but here's what I see from you. And he kind of lays that out very bluntly, very, very directly for them in that middle section in chapters 2 through 4 there. Chapters 5, now we're cooking, now we're moving. Okay, so chapter 5, we have the completion of the treatment of the two views that we see, that potential versus the reality, through a couple of different literary devices. There's a parable of the farmer and his vineyard. There's a pronouncement of 6 woes. And then there's this metaphor of an invading army bringing God's discipline. And that metaphor should hit close to home because they're surrounded by nations that don't like them. And on the outskirts of those smaller nations that don't like them, we have the 2 world powers that are big enough to actually wipe them out. And so when you start talking about a metaphor of an army coming in to destroy, that could become a reality very, very easily, very, very quickly. So that metaphor should hit home, is what God hopes will be something to kind of drive that point home for them. Isaiah 6, one of the great chapters of Isaiah, has that vision of Isaiah with the 4 living beings, and they're at the throne of God, and he sees the hem of God's robe filling the temple, and the smoke, and the holy, holy, holy is Lord God Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory, and all of this vision. And Isaiah is called into worship. He's called into communion with God. And he recognizes, I'm unclean. I shouldn't be here. I should not be in God's presence. And that angel takes the coal and touches his lips and refines him and heals him of his sin. So it starts off as a beautiful vision, but then it turns into Isaiah's commission. You know, who will I send? Who will go for me? And Isaiah, here I am, send me. And Isaiah answers God's call, and then builds on that for the remainder of that chapter there, what God's call is going to be for him. Chapters 7 and 8. Why does Isaiah need to make his case to trust in God?
Well, I have right here 2 Kings chapter 16.
Well, what happens in 2 Kings
So,
chapter
2
16?
Kings 16 and Isaiah 7 are mirroring the same, event. But Isaiah 7, while we're there, in the days of Ahaz, son of Jotham, son of Uzziah, king of Judah, Rezin, the king of Syria, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, the king of Israel. So, the king of Syria, which would be Damascus, or Syria with an S, and the king of Israel, the northern kingdom, come together to wage war on Jerusalem. And so two of those small nations that are surrounding them have banded together to come and attack Judah. And so flipping all the way back to 2 Kings chapter 16, verse 7 says that, so Ahaz sent messengers to Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria. There's a difference. There's Syria and Assyria. He sends word to the major power of the north, Assyria, saying, I am your servant and your son. Come up and rescue me from the hand of the king of Syria, from the hand of the king of Israel, who are attacking me. Ahaz also took silver and gold that was found in his house of the Lord and in the treasures of the king's house, and sent a present to the king of Assyria. The king of Assyria listened to him. The king of Assyria marched up to Damascus and took it, carrying its people captive to Kir, and he killed Rezin. And so this is the need for trust to be placed in God, because Ahaz says, I'm going to trust in a foreign power. These people are coming around me, and again, you know what? Sometimes I don't know if demonize is the right word, but it's like, well, why couldn't you just trust God? Well, I mean, if there was, again, armies at the gate coming to take us and kill all of us, I mean, I think giving them a little benefit of the situation of being overwhelmed by there is just so much might laid against us. It is still a very narrow perspective, but it is something that we've fallen into, I believe, in our own life. How many times have we sacrificed the spiritual, the eternal, the great power that God is wanting us to lean on for something temporary or temporary relief or comfort or a situation where we can escape temporarily through other means than trusting and relying in God. But that's exactly what Ahaz does. He calls for Assyria to come in, and Assyria takes out the nation of Damascus, which is also Syria at that time. And so the next, well, I guess 7 and 8 really tell us about what is going on. But then the portents of the next couple chapters is that this I mean, even the end of chapter 8, you have called for rescue. You have said, hey, I need some help from these people, and you haven't trusted in God. And so the result of this is these people who you tried to get help from are going to come in, and they're going to take away the north, and they're going to siege your cities. And so there again, there is this, you did not trust the Lord, and so there is going to be punishment for that. And so again, that is essentially the historical outline, and then kind of Isaiah's interactions with Ahaz about, well, Ahaz, you haven't trusted the Lord. Ahaz, you haven't done this. And so there are some warnings against him. But in the midst of all of this, there is a continuous stream of prophecies. Isaiah 7, verse 14 says, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and call his name Emmanuel. So, again, there is this doom and gloom, this idea that you have disobeyed God. You haven't trusted, you haven't done what he asks of you, and so you're going to be punished. But in that punishment, there is still going to be a sign. There's going to be this man who's going to be born, and his name will be Emmanuel, which means God is with us. And so you will often see this dichotomy of clashing as we go through the entire other historical sections that there is a punishment, but there's also a great hope that is also coming in Jesus and the remnant that will be shared saved.
And you have to appreciate the emphasis on his name is Emmanuel, God with us, within the context of what you're just talking about. The army is at the gate. There's a foreign power coming against you. I can see that. And there's this sense of, if I put my trust in God, where is he? I mean, God dwells at the temple. He is in our midst. We know that, but I can see that army. But God says, I'm sending you a sign, and his name will be Emmanuel, which means God with us. And how comforting would it be to be able to see the army at the gate, but you also see God. You see him with you, and you know that he's going to be able to protect you. So I think that, the context of that passage there really brings out the importance of that aspect of God's desire for that close personal relationship, that he wants us to be so close that it's like we see him there. We know that his presence is with us, even when that army is at the gates. Jotham was a good king. He tried to do what was right, but he didn't get the final say because Ahaz comes along after him. So Jotham became mighty because he ordered his ways before the Lord his God. But Ahaz, I had the one there to Ahaz was not good. I thought I had a passage that says Ahaz was a bad dude. Ahaz did not do that. Oh, that's next. Okay, sorry. Well, there's that slide that I said keeps showing up. There it is again. More historical background. Ahaz was a bad king. So for the Lord humbled Judah because of Ahaz, king of Israel, for he had brought about a lack of restraint in Judah and was very unfaithful to the Lord. So the contrast between Jotham and Ahaz is also kind of played out in the way that God deals with them. The two major powers that we're dealing with this time are Assyria and Egypt. In the middle are the smaller nations of Judah, Israel, Edom, Moab, Syria, and Philistia. Syria and Israel, that's the Syro-Ephraimite War. Remember, we talked about that a lot, the Syro-Ephraimite War. Ephraim is that euphemism or that other name for Israel, the northern kingdom. So Syria and Israel aligned themselves against Jerusalem, but they're unable to take the city. And so they, but it's still bad that they did that. They should not have attacked their brethren. And there's that map that kind of shows you where Syria is up here. It's Arab, it's the Damascus, that's Syria, and Assyria is directly to their north there. So they aligned themselves with Israel against Jerusalem. King Ahaz was filled with fear, and he chose to seek protection against Syria and Israel. Despite Isaiah's warning, despite Isaiah's modeling of faith, that he should choose to trust God. He chose to put his trust in foreign powers. And so he's got Assyria to the far north, he's got Israel or Egypt to the south. He'd be happy with either one of those to come and rescue him. And so he puts out feelers to try to get them to come to his aid. Chapters 9 and 10, God sends Isaiah to help the people process life after the Syro-Ephraimite War. And so it ends with Syria and Israel. They have Jerusalem surrounded and they have them in siege, laid siege, but they are rescued. They are not able to complete that war and complete that siege. So what do we do next? Well, Isaiah explores 3 case studies of God's contemporary and future work related to some of the surrounding areas there and how God is going to use them to bring about his will.
And again, this is just to kind of show what the theological theme of God in this situation is using Assyria. There's judgment, God's 3 case studies of his work now and then his future work. It says, "Woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger, the staff in their hands is my fury. Against a godless nation I send him." And so Assyria comes against a godless nation, and they fall upon the nations that are godless. But even then, the end of the chapter says that he who is God will cut down the thickets of the forest with an axe. And so, again, I guess I didn't actually read the part, but there is this or a metaphor is the right word, a metaphor that Syria is the rod in his hands. God is going to use Syria to cut off nations. He's going to use Syria to take down these godless nations that have idols and all of these things. But eventually they're just as wicked. They're just as evil. And verse 15 says, "Shall the axe boast over him who hews it?" And so he made the axe, and the axe is Assyria, who he's going to use to chop down the other evil nations. But then again, the axe cannot speak to me and say, hey, we're above you. They're just a tool in God's hand. And so even the mighty king of Assyria is just a tool in God's hands for this work now that is being judgment brought upon the northern kingdom and the kingdom of Assyria, the kingdom of Syria, and then a future proclamation even against the kingdom of Assyria.
And eventually he's going to basically do the same thing with Babylon. He's going to raise up Babylon to come out and take out Assyria because Assyria was so wicked. And then he's going to have to do that again with Persia to come and take out Babylon because they were so wicked. And then he's going to do that again to take out Persia because they were so wicked. So it's like God uses kingdoms at his will to bring about his what he wants to happen. Chapters 11 and 12 wrap up this section. Isaiah moves beyond the narrow confines of Judah, so he takes this and kind of expands the view of what we're looking at. We've been looking at a very narrow conflict in this region of the world, but God has bigger plans than this. He envisions a kingdom that's going to envelop a far greater territory than just this little piece of ground that we've been looking at. And so there's a lot of prophecy here. There's a lot of look towards the future where he talks about a new king, a restored people, and a renewed worship. So God is not going to leave things in a shambles. Israel and Judah are pretty beat up at this point, and Israel is still a nation. They haven't been taken out yet, but the end is coming for the northern kingdom. Judah is still a nation. They've been beat up pretty bad. They're pretty weak, but God is not going to leave them there. He envisioned something bigger. Lesson 8 was 11 chapters, and that one was hard to get through, I remember. Nothing like 39, but it was hard to get through 11 chapters in one night. So there's that expanding view where it's like you're in Google Earth, if you've ever used that app, and you're looking at McPherson, Kansas, then you want to see something bigger, so you scroll out and you get a bigger view. So 1 through 12 focused on just some local issues. 13 through 23 focused on 12 nations of the ancient world. And then chapters 24 through 27 take up even bigger issues than that, which get into the spiritual realm, cosmic issues. So 13 through 23 points to the known world, and it lists these 12 nations and their woes and their judgments pronounced against each of these 12 nations during those chapters for specific things that they have done that have angered God, or that have set them against God, or set them against God's people.
Well, notice who's still there. We still got Israel. We still got Judah. So even the people of God were claimed some woes against because they weren't faithful either. So.
Yeah, they were counted amongst the unfaithful, even as God was pronouncing woes and judgment against them. And there's kind of an expanded view again. We've looked at a couple of maps already, but this one has an expanded view where you can see some of those nations in red that are mentioned there, and fills up kind of the known world at that time, or the world that pertains to biblical things. Chapters 28 through 33, then these chapters represent messages that Isaiah spoke in Jerusalem in the days leading up to and during the Assyrian siege. Once Judah allied themselves with that northern kingdom of Assyria to come and rescue them from Syria and Ephraim, or Syria and Israel, they set the stage for a future siege, for a future battle that was going to take place. They opened the door to the enemy. They said, we will ally ourselves with you, and once you do that to a stronger power, you now are subjugated to that stronger power. And so a king arises of Assyria named Sennacherib, and Sennacherib is not a good guy. There's that review slide again, it keeps showing up. So we'll jump right past that. The historical setting for these later chapters, Isaiah uses the end times events to give hope for their present. For chapter 28 through 33, kind of where we're at, Isaiah uses the fall of North Israel to warn about their present. It's Sennacherib in the year 701 or so, where he leads a siege against the northern kingdom of Israel. They are taken into captivity, and Israel, the northern 10 tribes, no longer exist as a nation after this point, ever again. There is no longer, ever, a northern kingdom of Israel, because they have been taken by Assyria. In chapters 34 and 35, Isaiah uses Edom to warn about their present, and then the last couple of chapters we'll see that Isaiah narrates the events at the ends of the 8th century leading up to the Assyrian invasion of 701. Kind of backtracking a little bit here, Isaiah 34 and 35. Isaiah 34 is a violent chapter, and God is the one committing the violence. And we had a kind of a whole series of slides talking about the notion that we serve a violent God. And that is a major concern and a major criticism that many people who are opposed to God in our society have against the God that we serve, that we serve a God that would ever commit violence. So we talked a lot about that. Remember what you said, because that was your lesson.
I didn't know it was a long time ago.
That's not fair. First of all, God is a righteous and holy God. God is a jealous God. And he can be perfectly holy and perfectly righteous and still perfectly jealous. And so when we offer to false gods what belongs to the true God, it's an appropriate response of the true God, to be jealous of that worship, to be jealous of what we've offered to a false God. And so his response is justified in claiming the retribution that he is due. Teresa.
I just wonder if people, I think maybe deep down they are afraid of God's judgment, but they don't want to think that God will judge them. And he is, like you said, he is righteous and he is holy. His judgments are righteous. He has a right to judge us when we have not submitted to him.
He has that right, and he is perfectly holy. And I think you're right that there are people who want to...
I think they're afraid, but they don't want to admit that
They want to negate that aspect of God's character or kind of write it out of his character because they don't want to deal with it. They don't want to accept that it's a possibility or that it is true. We love, and we've been studying, all this year on Sunday mornings, love, and it's a wonderful part of God's character. And boy, we need to understand God's love, maybe more than we need to understand anything else. But that's not all that God is. There are other passages that say God is jealous, that God is a God of wrath, that God is a God of justice, that God is a God of to be feared. These things. So we don't just focus on one characteristic or one aspect of God and shun the others or forget about other aspects or characteristics of God's character.
something else I think that we need to keep in mind is salvation is conditional. And God is the one who has set those conditions, and it's up to us to meet them.
God does set the conditions for salvation. God does set the conditions for who his people are. So that's exactly right. Isaiah 34 has that discussion or that picture painted of God as being God having a violent reaction to the sins of the people. And remember, all the way back through this whole thing, we've been painting God as that ideal father, that ideal physician, that ideal husband. And we've seen all along the way how Israel has not fulfilled her obligation to be the ideal son, to be the ideal wife, to be the ideal patient. And God's response to sin is not pretty, but sin is not pretty. Sin is not pretty. And so God's response to that is in kind. And then in Isaiah 35, we have a shift where it shifts away from that violent response to sin to what comes next. After God has spent his wrath, what happens after that? So when the wicked world is put in its place, here's the things that will happen next. And nature is renewed, people are renewed, and the future is renewed. So there is hope there is a rebuilt future within the context of the things that God will tear down in his violence as a response to the sin of the people. We have in Isaiah chapter 36 and 37, these things take place during the Assyrian invasion of 701 BC. And you can take a kind of a walk through scriptures through the chapters of 2nd Chronicles and 2nd Kings and kind of follow the Assyrian army as they make their march down through the northern kingdom, where they lay that kingdom to waste and they lead them off into captivity, and they're no more, they're gone. And then they just continue that attack down into Judah, into the southern kingdom, and they start laying waste to several cities. And there's a city in southern Judah, for instance, called Lachish. And Lachish was the southern outpost. It was their military stronghold in southern Judah. And it was basically protected Jerusalem's flank coming from the southeast. And so Assyria comes out of the north and encircles Jerusalem. They make a sweep through southern Judah and wipe out their southern stronghold, and then they make their way up to Jerusalem. They lay siege to Jerusalem, and it's ugly. There are 185,000, I think, troops is what it says there were of the Assyrian army that lays siege to Jerusalem. And Hezekiah looks out and sees that army there, and he has nowhere to turn to. And there's this back and forth of the Assyrian general speaking to the people, to the leaders of Jerusalem as they stand on the wall. And the leaders of Jerusalem say, speak to us in Assyrian, we can understand it. And the Assyrian generals say, no, we're going to speak to you in your language so all the people can hear what we have to say. And they read the letter that talks about how they are supposed to, or how they have laid waste all the nations around them, and their gods were unable to protect them. And you would be foolish to think that your God can protect you from us in this scenario. And so Hezekiah lays that letter out before God and prays that God will protect him. And Isaiah then comes to Hezekiah and said, your prayers have been heard. God will protect you. So the Assyrians had attacked and subdued 46 cities, and then they get to Jerusalem. And even today, archaeological evidence remains of Sennacherib's temple, or
Conquest?
palace,
Yeah.
the place he lived. His palace has been uncovered, and they've got these huge murals and carvings, and it talks about his conquest. And it says that he had Hezekiah trapped like a bird in a cage. That's how it ends. He had Hezekiah trapped like a bird in a cage in Jerusalem. And then they woke up one morning and his whole army was dead. And so Sennacherib goes home without an army and without having captured Jerusalem, and he is assassinated because he obviously is very weak. If he is not strong enough to go down with an army that size and capture piddly little Jerusalem, then he is a weak leader, and we'll just take him out and we'll put somebody else in his place. So his son's assassinated. So it's a great story. And that's the setting. That's what's happening as Isaiah prophesies in chapters 36 and 37. The final chapters take up crucial events. Act 1 is that siege of Jerusalem in verses chapters 36 and 37 that we just talked about. And then after that, Hezekiah becomes ill, and he prays, and God hears his prayer and gives him, is it 15 more years? I think it's 15 more years.
Yes.
Which sounds good, but bad things happen during that 15 years. During that 15 years, there's a Babylonian emissary that is sent to visit Jerusalem, and Hezekiah sins. He shows them the storehouse of the temple, and he shows them, all the stuff, and he's just basically inviting a foreign power, a foreign army in to see all of the stuff that he has, and that's not a good thing to do. It's during that 15 years that a guy named Starts with an M. Bad king. Manasseh, thank you. All I could think of was Melchizedek, but he was a good guy. And that was way long ago. That was way back during Abraham's time. Manasseh, who is a bad king, ends up being one of the worst kings, is born to Hezekiah. And so you look at that, you know, Hezekiah's illness, he's on his deathbed, he's going to die. He prays for more time, and God gives him 15 years. Was it a good thing after all? Well, there's some bad stuff that happens. Is Hezekiah still a good king? Yeah, he was still a good king. But did he end as strong as he was during the middle portion? You know, and he made some mistakes during the end. So it's an interesting kind of end to that section. It's an end to that story that kind of leaves you scratching your head a little bit about how Hezekiah is to be viewed. So based on the dates of those things, Hezekiah's illness is often said 704 BC. So kind of the historical setting there, which is actually before the siege of Jerusalem. Because that happened in 701. But so maybe he needed to survive that illness so that he could be there for the siege. Okay, well that gets us down to the end. You got some final thoughts?
Just a couple of final thoughts, I guess.
Okay.
So, it is, well, there's, obviously Isaiah is a book of prophecy, and there's lots of good prophetic sayings that we have, lots of cool hymns that come out of the book of Isaiah. But the history kind of repeating itself. It is, the kings. Ahaz, we see, was an evil king. He called to Assyria for help, and we see Hezekiah trusting in God as contrary to the actions of Ahaz. But in chapter 31, Isaiah includes some of these woes, and 31 verse 1 says, "Woe to those who go down to Egypt for help and rely on horses, who trust in chariots because they're many, and in horsemen because they are very strong. But do not look to the Holy One of Israel or consult the Lord." So there is a need for Isaiah to include this in here. And then I guess that would have been a really strong temptation, and even probably a likelihood that Hezekiah would have been, at least in some form, trying to rely on Egypt to get them out of this war with Assyria. And so but the Egyptian reinforcements never come. They never show up. They choose not to come. And so, verse 3 says, "The Egyptians are man and not God, and their horses are flesh and not spirit. When the Lord stretches out his hand, the helper will stumble, and he who is helped will fall, and they will all perish together." And so, again, there's this idea of, well, Hezekiah might have been even trying to rely on Egypt, but Egypt decided not to show up. And so he was left with nothing else other than rely on God. But he still ends up doing that in the end. He relies on God and trusts on God. So, this is our overview of Isaiah, 1 through 39. It's been very, very brief, but moving into this next section, we'll be talking more a little bit about Babylon, about restoration, about hope, about the end of the things. One of the things that I thought I might mention, because this will probably be the last time I'm in Bible class for a couple of weeks, is that, the reason why Isaiah is kind of broken up into these two sections is because there's a little bit of a shift between Isaiah 1 through 39 and 40 through 66. And so there's this big idea that, well, they're not the same book, that they're separated and apart and they're different. And some, we could have spent a long time tonight discussing, well, this is one of the theories, is that Isaiah wrote all these prophecies and he sealed up his things in a scroll. And in 200 years later, when the king of when Cyrus, the king of Babylon, is doing all of these things that Isaiah will prophesy about 200 years before, people will say, well, he couldn't have known these things. So it had to be someone who was writing it back in. And, hopefully that's confusing, because it is. But it boils down to this. We've read this in John chapter 12, and I wanted to read that to kind of give us some assurance of different things, because this comes from the mouth of Jesus. John chapter 12, verse 37 through 47. This we just talked about this last week, but when verse 37, when Jesus had said these things, he departed and hid himself from them. Though he had done so many signs before them, they still did not believe him, so that the word spoken by the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled. Lord, who has believed what he has heard from us, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? That is in Isaiah chapter 53, verse 1. Therefore they could not believe, for again Isaiah said, he has blinded their eyes and hardened their hearts, lest they see with their eyes and understand with their hearts and turn, and I would heal them. Isaiah said these things because he saw the glory and spoke of him. And so, no matter what these people will toss around, the Gospel of John, the Holy Spirit says, this is the book of Isaiah. This is what Isaiah wanted to say, and Isaiah is prophesying about these events that will happen in the future because of the work of God in his life. And so I guess you guys and I will be attempting to follow along with our studying about these things that Isaiah is prophesying about 200 years before they will happen. 200 years before this guy named Cyrus will exist. But it's still something that God and Isaiah are writing together as he is recording this on the scroll. And that was one of the last things that I wanted to say, along with the fact that this is written on a scroll, and when Jesus stands up to read from Isaiah, he is reading from a scroll. And Jesus knows right where to go in this long scroll without chapters. And so Isaiah was something near to Jesus' heart, and I think it's something that can be near to our heart as well, even though it might be a little more historical in Old Testament and not as exciting as reading about some of the narratives of Jesus. Isaiah is still important, and it is something that is very much needed for us today. And there are applications that I think you guys and Jason will be able to draw out of the text. So hope Jason will see you guys next week. Join us then. Thank you for your time.